So I'd like to begin to reflect and acknowledge the land I am on today. On the screen, you will see the traditional territories of the Indigenous nations that Sheridan College is currently occupying, which is Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. For myself, I recognize the honor it is to be a settler of Turtle Island and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, where it is incredibly green and so beautiful. I acknowledge the importance of this land where I am able to call it my home, and where so many of my family and friends are able to call it this land home as well. As I reside on this land, I understand that it is my responsibility to honor and respect those who have gone before, those who are here, and those who have yet to come. For everyone that is joining the session today, I urge everyone to please recognize that it is your responsibility as well. So please visit Whose Land, which I will put into the chat. And there's also going to be another link called Native Land. So for Whose Land, it's specifically for those in Canada, and Native Land for those outside of Canada. I believe Native Land isn't 100% updated. So your territory might not be on there, but if it is, that'd be great. But where you can learn where you're currently residing on. I'm going to give it a minute for everyone to find where you are. And also I'm going to ask everyone to please take a second and reflect on a piece of the land you are very grateful for. It could be the trees, it could be the soil. If you have a body of water that's near you. So I'll give you a minute to reflect on whose land you're currently occupying, as well as reflect on a piece of the land that you're grateful for. And if you are, if you're willing to share, please share it within the chat. I'm going to share my little piece into the chat. So for myself, I am grateful to be here on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. As I'm on this land, I am so thankful for all the vibrant and beautiful trees around me. I'm thankful for the oxygen that it gives me, the nutrients it gives the soil, and the shelter it gives to the animals around me. So I'm going to give it a minute for everyone to visit those links to recognize the land you are on. So please feel free to share in the chat if there is a component of the land that you are thankful of. Again, it could be the trees, it could be the soil, a body of water that's close to you. So for those who don't know, June is National Indigenous History Month, and it is soon ending. So I hope past the month of June that we all continue to acknowledge the colonial violence of the past and the present, and continue to acknowledge that it is each our own responsibility to honor and respect all of the lands. I also hope that from today you gather all your learnings and your teachings that you receive, and take it and share it within your community as well. Again, apologize to my slow PowerPoint. There we go. So again, welcome to Indigenous Perspectives. If you don't already know, it is part of the Social Impact Catalyst series that is powered by RBC Future Launch. Not only do we have this workshop that you're visiting today, we have 2 other workshops that are coming up on July 5th, Digital Marketing and Sales, Legal Bootcamp for Startups on July 21st. If you haven't already, please feel free to register with us, which I will put into the chat. And we also have other sessions that aren't available yet, so feel free to follow us on Eventbrite as well. Another session that we have that is coming up, if you can join, is the Mindful Leadership, a Path to Clarity and Courage. It is in person, so if you are in the United States, I'm sorry, but it is in person. That is happening. That is happening soon, so please join us, which I will put into the link as well. Yes.
Erica, do you want me to share the slides, or I guess you're passing it off to Lorena soon though?
Yes, and I will share the link later since my computer is having some difficulties, so sorry about that. Before I do introduce Lorena, I do want to tell SIC to please stay behind after the session, as there are going to be some reminders, so please stay after the session. And without further ado, hold your breath. There we go. Our great facilitator for today. I'm very looking forward to it. We've had a session with her last cohort as well too, and it was a great session, and I hope everyone enjoys it tonight as well. Lorena is Anishinaabe Kwe born and raised in Windsor, Ontario. She is an experienced educator with demonstrated history of working in the nonprofits industry. Lorena also specializes in the development and facilitation of training embedded in adult learning principles, trauma-informed approaches, and Indigenous ways of knowing and worldviews. She is also skilled in nonprofit organizations, youth development, facilitation, training design and delivery, and proposal writing. Lorena completed her Master of Education at York University in April 2022. So congratulations, focusing on urban Indigenous education. Lorena prioritizes balances in all areas of her life and believes that culture, language, family, and mentorship have helped her become who she is today. So welcome, Lorena. Thank you so much for joining us and facilitating tonight's session.
Miigwech, and thank you for the introduction. So bonjour. Ni yag wawasekwe Indigenous cause gawin ning ganamasi nindodum Windsor Ndojaba Beisho St. Clair Zagagen Toronto Ndoji Anishinaabe and Dao. So if there are any language speakers in here, I'm still learning and I'm on my journey to learning Anishinaabe Moin. But I just wanted to provide a brief introduction of myself and who I am within the language. One of the things I've always been taught is how important it is for us to try and regain our language, because so much of our language and who we are is about our connection and relationship to the land, to the community, to the generations that came before us, and to those generations that are still yet to come. And so I wanted to, I've been slowly learning my language, so I'm trying to get there. and wanted to just try and introduce myself a little bit in that. So in my introduction, I introduced myself as Wawa Sekwe Indigenous, and that's my name that was given to me by the late Peter O'Chise. And it translates to loon woman, but talks about a specific loon from one of the creation stories. And I'm still working on learning more about specifically what the name means and what relates to me. But one of the things I've always been taught was that loons have a very specific responsibility in Anishinaabe teachings to speak externally to community. And so if you've ever heard a loon before, one of the things you'll know about loons, if you live in anywhere where there's a lake in Northern Ontario or even other places around the world, that the loons, they have this beautiful call when they speak, and they're very loud, and you can hear them. They call it the song of the loon often because of the way their song projects. And so one of their roles is to speak externally to community. And so I find that very fitting that one of the things that I do in my day-to-day job is facilitate workshops and have conversations and have those external conversations with people to help raise awareness, to discuss Indigenous worldviews, and to really share that knowledge from that perspective. Oh, that's amazing. I see that the loon is this official state bird of Minnesota. Awesome. I guess I'm gonna have to go to Minnesota and visit. But today I want to share a little bit about Indigenous perspectives on sustainability. And so I'm really gonna look at different things. I'm gonna go back through and break down a little bit about the land acknowledgement, a little bit more, and just really relating it, what that means to sustainability. I do have a few videos. I also have a few breakout rooms that I would like. So many of you are strangers, so give you a chance to chat with each other a little, get to know each other across the borders. I know we have people who are also in other areas. I think I saw Trinidad and Tobago, Minnesota, Colorado, right? It'll be an opportunity to have these conversations from your own perspectives and from your own areas of where you're working, where you live. So without further ado, I'll get started and share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, I actually think I have to stop sharing because I forgot to hit that button that says share audio. So I'm gonna do that right now. Just give me 1 second. You know, you'd think 2 years of a pandemic that I'd have this down pat by now, but I do not. There, okay. So just wanted to share this piece around Indigenous perspectives on sustainability, but really looking at it from a lens of relationships. So one of the first things, and thank you so much, Erica, for doing the land acknowledgement, is really talking about the land, but also not just the land, but how the land relates to sustainability, how it relates to relationships. One of the things that I think is so key to whatever work that we do, whatever conversations we have, is this understanding of land, but also environmental and also racial justice. They're all connected. All these things that we have conversations about, whether it's racial justice, whether it's climate change, it's environmental studies, it's relationships, they're all interconnected. And as we have some of these conversations, so let's start to unpack a little bit about what that looks like. So similarly to Erica, I want to also acknowledge the land on which we gather. So for myself, I'm in Toronto currently on the treaty territories of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the Two Row Wampum. And I'll actually talk a little bit about what at least the dish with one spoon treaty means a little bit more and really start to break that down, because oftentimes we hear these words of Turo wampum, or we'll hear dish with one spoon, but we don't know what that means. We just acknowledge it. And so one of the things I think is really important is that we do have that conversation. And so I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm sitting here on today is also the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations. This includes the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Confederacy, the Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, but also many Indigenous nations that have traveled this land in the past, but also continue to live there today. And I think that's a really key piece that we need to recognize, is really emphasizing that, you know, when we do land acknowledgements, oftentimes you're hearing more and more of them in organizations, in universities, in, you know, municipalities, you're seeing them. And oftentimes they're very standardized. And one of the things even Erica did was really customize it, really provide her own positionality to it. And that's part of building your relationship with it. It's part of recognizing who you are and what do you relate to in this space? What do you relate to where you are? And in doing that, you also recognize that the history hasn't stopped for Indigenous people, that the history continues, that Indigenous people are still here today. So one of the things that is really important is that even Sheridan and the work that Sheridan does, it's really one of the things they do is identify that it's a collective responsibility to honor and respect that land. And it's a collective responsibility, not just as, you know, staff or teachers or students, but it's community responsibility to honor the land that is here, from those that have come here, those that are currently here, and those that are yet to come. And that's a very key piece that I talk about when I say yet to come. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit throughout the entire session, is this concept of future generations, and this understanding that whatever we do today, we need to acknowledge that we're here today because of those that have come before us, but we're here today to represent and support those that are yet to come. And so acknowledging the land is really an essential part of understanding Indigenous cultures and relationships, as it reminds us of the gifts that come from the land and our responsibilities to the land, our responsibilities to taking care of that land that's here, of being stewards of the land. One of the things that I think is so key as we move through this journey of sustainability and understanding Indigenous perspectives, it's about a relationship. It's about working together. It's not about owning land. It's about how do we work together to live on this land and share it. So one of the things I really encourage you is, if you're doing a land acknowledgement in a presentation or a conference, at a meeting, if you're developing one for your organization, to really do that work to understand the history from the past and how it relates to the present, and also where do you fit into that. And although you may develop a standardized one, think of your own when you're talking about it, your own positionality of where you sit in relationship to that land acknowledgement. So I have a video here and I want to share. It's a video actually from a knowledge keeper named Stephen Paquette from Sheridan, and he shares his perspective on land acknowledgements and why it's important to do land acknowledgements. And after this, we'll do a quick, a short breakout room, but I want you to have that opportunity to have conversations about what we've talked about already around land acknowledgements, but also what Stephen talks about within his own perspective. So I'll play the video. Hopefully you can hear it. Erica will let me know if you can't.
What I've learned from my elders is that when we do acknowledgement of the land, it's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to. because that Indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We were simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth. It's our relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with the trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with the plant life that is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients, it gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred, water is life. And what we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the woman. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to the next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father-son, or in some nations, brother-son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know all throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that Indigenous people were, for the most part, nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations have walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
So one of the things that I think is, I just want to ask before we continue on, pause, don't play again, I'll stop sharing, is I want to take a moment just to see if there's anything that Stephen shared or said that stood out for any of you. You can feel free to unmute yourself or jump in the chat and share, but I think it's really important to unpack this a little bit. What might have stood out for you, or was there something that Stephen said that is sticking with you? So one of the things we see in the chat is someone mentioned it's not about ownership of the land, but rather those relationships. Pepper, I see your hands up. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think everything that he said stood out for me, because I never looked at it that way. This really is about perspective, because I think my perspective completely grew and just in that video, and what you said before that. And I always thought it was about the land, but it's not just about the land, right? It's about us as caregivers of the land. Yeah, I'm processing right now. So it's like, thank you for that. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Pepper, for sharing. And Jennifer also added in the chat, they added mentioning of being nomads was important to me, given I do not identify of a particular site or region other than living in the USA. And I think that's a key piece, right? Even us talking about, the United States versus Canada, these, they're countries that are established now, but one of my teachings is that, North America, all the way down to the tip of Mexico, all is part of something called Turtle Island. And these borders are man-made borders that we have, our communities have always had relationships trans-border that we have now that went far beyond what we're allowed to designate ourselves as Canadian or American or Mexican or whatever it is, right? And so now, like, we talk about it this way as the South versus North, but it's all this story, and it's part of our creation stories that tell us that, we've been here since time immemorial, that since the moment the earth became the earth and North America became something, that Indigenous people have been here. But now we categorize ourselves in different areas, in different countries, where we have to now ask permission to go visit our relatives south of the border. There are so many communities that were able to just move freely until 1876, when Canada became a country, right? That we have things known as, the Jade Treaty, or so many treaties. I can't even go through them all. The Treaty of Paris, right? All these treaties that set this area of how we cut up the land. And that cutting up of the land was based on land ownership, not that, land stewardship, which was the original intention of many of the treaties. Darren added, land back has a new meaning for me now. And absolutely, land back was never about, give us all the land back and everyone go back home. That's never what it was about. It was about honoring the treaties that were established. That when we talk about treaties, it's even talking about, 6 nations of the Grand River and the Haldimand Treaty, and that tract that was given, and the amount of land that was originally acknowledged in treaty was only given in a very small amount. I'm trying to think of the documentary 6 Miles Deep talks about the Haldimand Treaty that was negotiated, which is really around where that land back conversation is. You're hearing a lot of it in Caledonia, near 6 Nations, and there's been a lot of that conversation, and there's a really good documentary. And I know, like, Erica's great at, like, finding things for me, and so I'm sure she's, like, looking it up right now. Maybe not. Now she is. But if you can find the link to that documentary at all and put it in there, even just the name of it, it's an amazing documentary that really digs into what was the original negotiated treaty around that, and why is this conversation of land back that? It wasn't about give us all back the land. It was like, how do we work together to take care of the land, but also honor those original agreements that were established? And so as we continue on this piece, it goes back to that relationship, and going back to that relationship when we talk about land. And one of those, and I love Robin Wall Kimmerer, she shares in some of her work, she talks about, it's not just the land that is broken, but it's our relationship to the land that is broken. And we understand, the impacts of climate change, the impacts of on the environment, and understanding that, we're seeing all these things happening. We're seeing, ice caps melting faster than they ever have before. We're seeing more and more diseases coming to the forefront. And a lot of it has to do with the impacts to our land, to our mother. And so when we talk about the land being broken, it's how we treat that land. It's that relationship to that land. And so when we talk about the land acknowledgement, it's important for us to have that conversation. It's important for us to honor and acknowledge the different relationships that exist for our communities. And so one of the things we do ask is that we recognize in why is it important for us to have that understanding of land, of history, where we work, where we live, where we learn. You know, in my introduction, in the language, I said, you know, I live in Toronto currently. That's where I live. But I was born and raised, and I mentioned Windsor, I mentioned Sinclair, and that's Lake St. Clair. That's the closest waterways to me. And it's important for me to acknowledge that, that's the closest waterways to where I was born. I was born and raised in Windsor. That's where I come from. And so when I do that, I'm not just acknowledging the land in which I'm currently on. I'm acknowledging the land in which I've always come from, which my family comes from, generations come from, my relationships come from, where I learned, where I grew up from. I'm acknowledging my responsibilities to my communities. I'm acknowledging my relationships that I might not be able to see as much anymore because I live in Toronto, but I'm also recognizing my responsibility to the people that are still there. You know, today, actually, my niece is graduating grade 12, and, you know, she is in Windsor. And so even by me acknowledging that I'm from Windsor, I'm also recognizing my relationships that are there today and celebrating on that land. And so when we talk about this whole piece around land acknowledgement and introducing ourselves and where we come from, who we are, all these pieces, it brings it all into perspective, and it brings it all together. And it talks about, you know, it's through these relationships, when we talk about them and we acknowledge them and we understand them, that we really start to come to understand that everyone has a role to play in taking care of the land. Everyone has a responsibility to be environmental stewards. Everyone has a role in that. And how we honor the land and maintain its health, it's our responsibility to understand that, to recognize that, because in doing that, we can begin to nurture future generations and help them understand that it's up to each and every one of us. Yes, Braiding Sweetgrass, amazing book. That's the one, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who she wrote that book and really talks about those interconnected relationships as well. So thank you for adding that, Sharon. So when we talk about, and I'm going to talk about this treaty belt on the screen in just a moment, but when we talk about sustainability, the most common understanding of sustainability is known through the United Nations report on Sustainable Development Goals. And it breaks it down as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so it's really key, this piece around, again, even in a non-Indigenous view, you're hearing the importance of future generations. You're hearing the importance of acknowledging relationships, that it's not just about us here today. It's about understanding our own needs, but how do we do that in a way that makes sure that there's the land for future generations? And so one of the ways that I think, or the best way for us to even be able to understand that as an Indigenous person, for me, was through the teaching of the dish with one spoon, or even the teaching of the 7 generations principle. And I'll talk a little bit about those in just a little bit, but I want to talk about specifically the dish with one spoon treaty belt. And that's the one I have here on the slide. And I'm going to have a more thorough picture of it in just a moment. But it's really important that we talk about the dish with one spoon, because when we look at this and we understand what the treaty means. So when we're reading a land acknowledgement or we hear the word dish with one spoon, we begin to break down what this actually looks like and what it means. And so in this understanding of the dish with one spoon, it talks about, we promise to only have one dish among us. In it will be beaver tail and no knife will be there. We'll have a dish, which means that we will have all equal share of the game roaming about in the hunting grounds and in the field. And then with that, everything will become peaceful among the people. And so that's a quote that from one of the translations of when the dish with one spoon was first brought back out. But the dish with one spoon was a peace treaty that was made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and other allied nations following the original writing of this treaty wampum belt agreed to sign on to this. And when they first developed it, it was actually during a time of war. There was a lot of war happening, a lot of fighting over land. And in the early 17th century and 18th century, they talked about all this war that was happening between these nations and a need to understand, how do we find a way to move towards peace and have equal peace amongst the land. And so when they started to do this treaty, and one of the things, and I'll quickly go back to the other slide just to see a bit of a better image of it, is if you look, each and every single bead here that is on this wampum belt is actually made out of something called a quahog shell. And a quahog shell, they're purple and white, and you can whittle them down to be one of these beads. And if you look very closely on some of them, they still have a faint color of purple on some of them. Some of them have dark purple beads. Some of them have faint purple still attached to it. This is a picture of a replica, which is made nowadays with PVC pipe. But traditionally, when these original wampum belts were written, they're done in a way that every time you whittled down one of these beads, one of those shells into a bead, you would spend that time thinking of the intentions you wanted in this relationship. You would spend the time thinking and putting prayers and good thoughts and acknowledgements of what you're hoping to receive out of a relationship, out of what you're hoping to receive out of this treaty. So wampum belts like this, and ones like the 2-row wampum or the guswanta, were things that were only utilized and written for the most important relationships that were to be established. Because you wouldn't just put one of these together for just any reason. These were for important contracts, important information to be transmitted, because each one of those wampum belts can have sometimes hundreds or thousands of these beads. And so if you're thinking of having to whittle down a shell into a bead, think of the time it takes to have to do that. And so when we talk about this relationship and we talk about the intent of the dish with one spoon, it was really about, and as this was being developed, about how do we build this relationship in a way that's based on peace. And so the treaty is important because it really set out terms for taking care of shared territory while maintaining separate and independent sovereign nations. So in this case, we're talking about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe nations. And so when we're talking about this relationship, and as other nations came into this land and came into the territory, they also agreed to this treaty, to this understanding. And so when we talk about the original treaty territory of the wampum, the dish with one spoon wampum treaty, it's supposed to surround the entire Great Lakes area. So most of Ontario, part of Quebec, a little bit of Manitoba, and even into the States in the Great Lakes area that surrounds there. And that's really what this treaty territory is. And so when it talked about it, the treaty is to understand, is understood as a relationship with rights and responsibilities. So in the very center of the wampum belt, you have these purple beads, which represent the dish. And they talk about it as this dish was utilized and it was sent around the circle. And in the dish was beaver. And at this time, beaver, you know, was a very important Anishinaabe delicacy and only feasted and utilized at some of the most important feasting events that you would have. And so they say there was no, and you can even see it in the quote, that no knife was there. And there's an important piece to that, because what they're trying to do is to build a relationship on peace. And if we bring knives, that means we're bringing weapons, and we're not coming to build peace. We're not coming in a way that's supposed to bring kindness and love and friendship. We're coming in a way where we're protecting ourselves. We're scared, we may harm. And so they talk about a spoon is there instead of a knife to represent this relationship. And this dish is supposed to go around the entire feast. And so one of the things that we talk about in this and how it's also supposed to represent this shared territory is that as the bowl goes around, you're supposed to understand how much you need for yourself. Because as you're taking some of the beaver for yourself, you have to look around the entire circle, because this dish is supposed to feed every single one there. And so when we're talking about the land in the treaty, and we talk about this in terms of sustainability and sustainable development, that it's the same understanding of this treaty land and this territory, that when we're on this land today, it's important for us to recognize how much we need ourselves as an individual. Because when we take this land and we take this, utilize these pieces, we're supposed to remember that there's other generations that are coming that need this land. And so we only are supposed to utilize and take what we need, because the rest has to be left for those that are yet to come. It's about the really understanding the dish representing shared territory. So the territory around the Great Lakes, but it also represents harmony and interconnections. And it represents that in a way that all nations are responsible for taking care of that dish, for ensuring that there is enough for other people, that there's enough for other nations that are to come, that there's enough for our children and our grandchildren, that neither of us can abuse those resources, which is also why knives weren't brought to this ceremony when this happened, and why there's no knives represented in this wampum treaty, because it's not about abuse or extraction. It's about promoting peace and working together to take care of it. The treaty was designed as a way to promote peaceful coexistence, and the intent was about regularly ensuring renewal of the relationship through meeting, through ceremony, through ritual. And it's done so in a way often that there's a feast. And so we're making sure people have, food, we're taking care of each other. It's about a relationship. If I'm building a relationship and inviting someone over, I've always been told that you don't bring someone over and you don't feed them, right? You always make sure there's food there, because it's about building a relationship. It's about building connection. You want to take care of those who are with you, who are near you. I hear a lot of people, they say, you don't go visit someone without bringing something. It's the same thing, right? It's about a relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's about interconnections. It's about harmony. It's about how do we do this in a good way? And so the concept of the dish with one spoon wampum really reflects the principles that were given within the Haudenosaunee creation story, in the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, with the peacemaker, talking about peaceful coexistence, about how do we work together, about how do we do this in a good way. And so it really talks to us about ensuring relationship is there, about ensuring responsibility to take care of not just the land now, but ensuring that we're teaching those to come to take care of that land. Because I'm here today because the people took care of the land enough for me to have some space, to have a family, to have community. And I need to ensure that there's land and space and community for my niece, for my great nieces, for my great grandnieces, right? That it's about making sure that down the line, the land is still viable for them. That the relationships that existed before are still viable for them. That understandings like the dish with one spoon, like the two-row wampum, are things that aren't history, that they're present in our lives. So I have a short video I want to share. It's with Gregory Cajete. He's an amazing scholar. He really talks about in this story about sustainability. And he talks about, there's a few things he talks about. He talks about teachings of looking to the mountain and talking about water is life. And we're gonna go into small breakout groups after this and have a little bit of a discussion about what are some things that Gregory Cajete talks about and how does it relate to sustainability.
Sengi Hung, as we say in Tewa. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo, and my greetings to you, and the pleasure that I have to share some thoughts and perspectives with you about a very special story that, in a sense, is a story of sustainability and is a story that is very ancient within the context of Puebloan peoples. And so the name of this story is really a Pueblo story of sustainability. And I invite all of you into the world of Pueblo people because the story actually is a story of emergence. It's a story that is shared, and if anything can be said about what is in common among Puebloan peoples is that we share a common story. Although we're very diverse, we have different languages, many different customs, but what we do share is this story. And this story of emergence is shared in many times, in many places, within the context of Pueblo communities, to describe and for us to remember what is our responsibility, what is our relationship, and what is the nature of the journey that we take as a people, as a community, through time and through space. So this is the story of Indigenous sustainability from a Pueblo perspective. So when one looks into the world from this Indigenous perspective, as this slide shows, what is seen is really a tapestry of interdependence, interrelationships. And so in the native eye, looking out into the world, there is this understanding that everything is related, everything is connected, and that we have a place within that tapestry of interrelationship, that tapestry within the world. Many times this notion of journeying through a storied landscape is described as a pathway in life. And so as we talk about what is the nature of this journey of sustainability, this story of emergence that is common to Indigenous peoples, and also especially relates to the journey of Pueblo people in this land, in this place, which is really a 20,000 year journey in this place, in this land. We refer to it basically as an understanding of that perspective. So one of the terms that we've used is look to the mountain. And in my language, it's pronounced Bimpio'obi. And when one says that, one begins to understand that when you look at something that is vast and large and has a very important kind of meaning to the people, that you have to look at the past, you have to look at the present, and you have to look at the future to have a complete perspective of understanding of where you may go and what you may do. Within the context of this, water as life is one of the first understandings of relationship and responsibility. The understanding that water is a part of all life, and that this is an important and essential understanding of relationship and responsibility. And in this metaphor, one begins to look at, in a sense, the mirror of the past. In this sense, this understanding that in order to understand yourself, you have to look at your past, and that mirrors back to you what you may do in the present and also the vision of the future. So as we move forward, as I said, Indigenous peoples, Puebloan peoples have been here for a very long time. We have a very long history, beginning with the Paleo-Indian hunters, evolving into the times of the first Puebloan communities, the first clans, evolving in time into the creation and forming of the first communities and forming the land in ways that allow us to create our communities. Those communities then becoming more and more complex, and with that complexity, there's an understanding that issues of sustainability become paramount to the survival of those communities. So in time, the understanding of that journey or that pathway through life and through that storied landscape brings us to the present time, so that there's a continuity between Puebloan peoples of the past and Puebloan peoples of today. So this understanding is a very, very essential understanding that is conveyed in the stories that we have. First is our relationship to animals, and this Hunter's Canteen from the Jemez Pueblo with the Heartline represents that very essential relationship that Pueblo people recognize, and that very special story that we have a relationship with animals. That takes the form of one of the metaphors that we often use for seeking life, hunting for life. So the whole notion and whole complex and history of hunting becomes a part of this process. Puebloan peoples dance for life. We dance our relationships with these very, very important entities that give us life both individually and within the context of community. One metaphor that I was reminded of was my grandmother used to say, "Hung indagimo," we are all but corn. And the idea of this notion is that, as you can see, there's each of these corn kernels are individuals. They're going to evolve into individual corn plants. But their characteristic is that they lean against other corn kernels on that corn cob. The corn cob is the structure of the community. The corn kernels are the individuals that make up that community. It is that understanding that unity in diversity matters and is very important in the context and creation of community as a whole. Our relationship to the Earth Mother is represented in this slide, the corn mother and her children. This understanding that the mother of all life essentially is the earth, and that she represents this spirit entity within the earth itself that comes forward in the context of this understanding of this story. And so tied to this is a whole complex of what is called indigenous knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge, which in a sense is a complex of understandings that have been conveyed from generation to generation that allow us to understand not only our relationship to each other, but our relationship and how to, in a sense, cultivate that relationship and sustain it through time and through generations. As we dance the buffalo dance, so as we dance our relationship to animals, we also dance our relationship to plants. And so the complex of corn dances that one witnesses actually beginning very soon and all the way through the life cycle of corn, all the way to harvest, is a representation of this understanding and this coming together to remember what is important. And that is really the sustainability of the people, the sustainability of the community through time and through generations. So what is it all about? Ultimately, what is this whole notion of sustainability really about? It's really about the good life. And so the harvest really represents that understanding of what it's all about. And in this context, one can see that seeking life, finding life, and having life are all combined in this context of understanding this metaphor. And so finally, this notion of native well-being, native foods, native health, native community, native family, native art, native teaching, native learning, becomes all of the ways in which, within the context of Puebloan communities, we reinforce and we remember what it is to be a part of the community and also to sustain ourselves as cultures through time and through generations. Likewise, as we sustain the land also sustains us in the context of this notion that we are related not only to the plants and to the animals, but we are actually very much the land itself. And so I leave you with these thoughts, these perspectives about understanding through metaphor, through image, through remembering to remember what is important. And so our feast, that food for life, in the context of celebrating our elders and the notion that they convey to us understandings and perspectives that are important to carry into future generations. And this whole notion that the spirit of sustainability is coming alive again. We call this the Indigenous mind rising. One can also say that it is the time when we must, as people of this earth, begin to once again respect and honor, and in a sense, begin to follow the music and the song and the dance of Kokopelli. He beckons us on. Thank you.
So I want to, we're going to break you all into groups in just a few moments. And the two questions we'll put them in chat and we'll also have them broadcasted. But the two questions I want you to consider is, did anything stand out for you that Gregory was discussing? And in the work that you're doing, whether it's with EDGE or whether it's with your own personal organization, or whether you're going to school and you're doing this work, or you're just here because you want to learn, what are there ways that you can really look to ensure that interrelationships and interdependence are integrated throughout what you're doing? So, Gregory talks a lot about, the corn, and he talks about relationships, and he talks about the importance of interdependence in leaning on each other when we need to. And so are there ways to ensure that that's happening in your work? Are there ways to ensure that that's happening in your learning, in your relationships, and the things that you do on a day-to-day basis? So I'm just going to stop sharing and add these to the chat. And then through the magic of Zoom, you will all be sent into breakout groups. And we'll do about 10 minutes, and I'll probably pop into all the different groups just to see how people are doing. But we want to just give you that chance to have that conversation and chat a little bit about what are your thoughts, and did anything stand out for you, and just how can you do this in the work that you do?
Okay.
So I think mostly everyone is back, and I just want to see if anyone wanted to share some of the conversations maybe they had, or any of the thoughts they had from the videos or so far from the session. Please feel free to add anything. Did anything stand out for you? Were there conversations that were really happening in your groups? had a couple really good questions in one of the groups I was in that I ended up not being able to jump out to other sessions because I was having such good question answerings. I will have time at the end of the session too, if everyone else has questions as well. But I just want to open it up to the large group. Does anyone want to jump in, or is there any thoughts?
Our group was kind of reveling in the things that technology has done for like facilitating these kinds of conversations, and just feeling very grateful for how things have come far. Yeah, because we had in my group, so I'm like 24, and then I was talking to Sahash and Rose, who are in high school, and then Darren, who's older than me, and so like talking about how things have changed in terms of this kind of conversation, and like how land acknowledgements have kind of come up fairly recently, and started to become much more normalized. Yeah, it was just interesting talking to everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. Darren, I see your mic's off. I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Hannah was just saying, that if it wasn't for the internet and actually maybe COVID even, a lot of this wouldn't be happening right now. And when I was younger, and like the girl in high school, none of this would even be a conversation right now. My family had to hide who they were. You might have faced it too, Lorena, that when they left Manitoba, they decided they were no longer Métis by the time they got to BC to make sure they had jobs when they got here. So a lot of us are now just learning who we are, and that's why we're joining things like this. Getting a bit emotional about it, but yeah, it's kind of nice to be allowed to be able to talk about it and find out who you are and see how many people are actually wanting to talk about it too. But
And thank you, Darren and Hannah, for both sharing that. I absolutely agree. I think, you know, COVID's really fast-tracked a lot of ways that technology can be used. I work for 2 organizations. I work part-time for Sheridan, but I also work for the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers as a side job, and or as my regular job. And it was amazing how we were able to quickly, for years we would said, oh, we don't do virtual trainings, and then suddenly COVID hit and we're like, oh, virtual learning everywhere. We have to move to online learning. And how many times now I've been able to talk to people in Tokyo, in Africa, in Cuba. I did a presentation for some grade 5 students in the Dominican Republic who wanted to learn more about Indigenous people in Canada. And those are things we never would have done in the past. But how much we're able to have these larger conversations and see that impact roll out, right? And see how we can have these conversations and actually build out this understanding of relationships even more. So thank you, both of you. Vanessa, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in our group, someone had commented that they don't feel comfortable talking about Indigenous issues. And I was like, hey, I'm Indigenous and I don't feel comfortable even having that conversation. So it's really echoing on, oh gosh, what's his name?
Darren.
The gentleman who spoke previously, Darren, yes, Darren Brager, really echoing on that topic. So the reason why I wanted to say that is if you are not Indigenous, it's okay. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about it, it's okay. And I think it goes to the same of, you know, if you're not a person of color, like if you're not Black or brown and, you know, you don't feel comfortable having those conversations, it's the same thing. So equalizes all of us, right? So I just appreciate that you guys had this. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And I think one of the things that's so important in that is like understanding our own relationship to the topics that are coming up, right? I agree with both, both Darren and Vanessa. When I was in grade school, these are conversations I would have never had because I wasn't proud of who I was. Talking about myself and my language, like even me sharing in my introduction and saying like I'm learning the language, like that's a key piece of saying, years ago, like me trying to learn the language wasn't something that I was interested in because it wasn't something that I thought I would be like proud to do. And I'm only learning words here and there, but it's something that is for me now something I'm coming more and more to terms with, that it although I might not ever be able to have a fluent conversation with anyone, that even just myself trying to learn one or two words is something that I'm trying to take on and understand within myself. But that not everyone, I think a key piece of this is that not everyone knows even the history, like the little bit of pieces of history about wampum bouts or things that I shared. Not everyone knows that. And not all Indigenous people know that. There's an assumption that all Indigenous people know all the Indigenous stuff. And so if you meet an Indigenous person, then they know it and you can ask them. But it's not true, because a lot of from generations and generations, topics around relationships, Indigenous values, wampums, treaties, it was taboo topics, and we didn't talk about it because it was something to be ashamed of. And only now, in the last, I'm going to say 10 years, even maybe 20, we're starting to see this resurgence of coming back to ourselves, coming back to our culture, communities, relationships, and starting to learn more. And so one of the things I would highly push is that when you're having conversations and building relationships with Indigenous peoples, not to assume that you can just ask them any questions they might not know. And it's about that relationship that you're building with them, and they may tell you their comfortability with it or not. I know in my group, there was a couple of questions. People were like, I don't know if this is offensive. And I'm like, I'm okay to answer those questions, because the last 10 years, they're conversations I've been very embedded in and have worked to do my own education and learning on. And so I don't take offense to it, as long as you're coming from a space of wanting to learn and be educated on it. And so as long as those are the conversations, I have no problem with answering the questions. If they're coming from a space that is intended to create harm and hurt, then I'll break it down, and well, it might not be as educational, but I'll do my best. But most of the time when I'm having these conversations, it's about wanting to learn, wanting to build a relationship, wanting to understand, how do we work together? How do we do this? And so any questions that usually come, I don't take offense, because it's an opportunity for at least me, for me to educate and inform to people who might not know or have had the opportunity to learn what I've been able to learn. And so thank you everyone so far for the conversations in the groups and the chats and the questions I've been receiving through messages. We're going to jump back into it. There's a few more slides and just pieces around Indigenous ways of knowing and doing that I want to talk about in terms of sustainability and relationships. So I'm going to jump back into my presentation. Again, if there's questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. You can send them to me privately as well, if you feel more comfortable that way, and I'll do my best to address them as we're going, or we can wait to the end and I can try and address them all at that point. So one of the things I love about what Gregory Cajete shares and talks about is he talks about corn, and he talks about corn as relationships. One of the things in the questions that I asked was a question about interdependence. And growing up, I was always taught, to be, you need to be independent. You need to not rely on other people. Growing up is about not needing others, not needing to rely on other people. But one of the things, and I think the things that stood out for me and the things that I learned more and more as I was going to ceremony, as I was engaging in community, as I was learning the teachings and the history, I was learning that it's not about being dependent on someone else, and being dependent on something else isn't something that's negative, and it shouldn't be seen as negative, but it always is. It's always seen as depending on something else, and depending on someone else is something that you shouldn't have to do. But one of the things I think Gregory really talks about is that the way the corn sits is that each of the kernels sit together so closely. And they sit so closely because they rely on each other to hold each other up. And I think about that, and I think about how important that is, even in, the work that we do, the work that we do in learning or building a community, whether you're in school or working in an organization. It's about how do we hold each other up? How do we stand by each other and lift us up? One of the things he talks about, and he talks about the kernel, and he talks about the corn, he talks about, each kernel is an individual kernel. And each kernel is diverse and it's unique, just like each person is. And we need each of those things to be able to build that piece of corn. Once you start taking little pieces of the kernel off, it starts to become a little unstable. And so when we have a full kernel with each individual kernel holding each other up, it becomes strong. And it talks about our relationships and how we move forward. It's about us working together to hold each other up, to move things forward, to create new initiatives, to move our land forward, to move our communities forward, to move our education systems forward, our organization, the technology. We all have our own unique and diverse way of doing things, and recognizing that the person standing next to us also has their own gifts, their own unique and diverse ways of building community, and that we need each other. And that's what this conversation is when we talk about sustainability. It's about each of us and our diverse and our uniqueness working together in unity to build that relationship. Because that relationship of interdependence and knowing, I have to depend on other people to make sure that, we have future generations is important. And being dependent on other people to move community forward isn't something to think of as a negative. That having interdependence and interrelationships is key to anything that we want to do. It's important to who we are, how we take care of our families, how we take care of our children, how we take care of the land, how we take care of the waters. That I can't do it all myself. I need to rely on other people, and to know that that's okay. And I think that's one of the key pieces that really stands out for me when Gregory talks about in that video, he talks about that we are all but corn. And to recognize that we need those relationships, and that corn can teach us that. I'm going to share another video at the end in just a few slides, and it's Winona LeDuc, and I had the privilege yesterday to actually listen to her speak at a conference here in Toronto. I was like, I don't often fangirl, but I was watching virtually, but I had a colleague who was there in person, and she's like, I went to the washroom and I walked by her and she touched my arm, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, I would have cried and been like, I'm never washing my arm again. But we'll listen to her speak in a little bit. But I had the privilege of listening to her, and she also talks about how corn teaches us many things and that we can learn from that. And so if anything, I from this presentation, I hope that one of the takeaways is that it's important for us to rely on each other, and that we don't also have to do it on our own, because if we try to do it all on our own, we'll never get anywhere. It's about relationships, not just to each other, but to the land, and understanding that as much as we need the land needs us. It's about reciprocity. And another piece that he talks about in this video, he talks about to look to the mountain. And he says, when we look to the mountain, it's about looking at the past, present, and future. And that's a teaching that they have. And one of the teachings I have is the concept of Bidaben. And Bidaben actually translates to the point at which the light touches the earth at the break of dawn. And so if you ever are up at, well, right now in summer, it's like 4 a.m., you just see the very point of the sun barely even rising. You just see that very tiny bright light, and it's starting to rise. That is Bidaben. And what they talk about is Bidaben actually translates to past, present, and future. B, the B-I-I, that's past. Da is present, and Ban is future. So Bidaben. And when it talks about it, it talks about us, you know, recognizing all the histories that have happened in our lives, in our families, and that those histories reflect today in the work that you do, and whether it's trauma you're experiencing, whether it's healing that you're doing, whether it's learning and education that you're going through, whether it's a healing journey, whatever it is, that past reflects in our present. And as we move in our present, it's about everything, recognizing that everything we do needs to understand those future, that there's a future. So one of the things I think about, and people may have heard it in different ways, is the 7 generations principle that is understood in different teachings from different communities, but we all have very similar concepts that break down around the past impacting the present and the future. And one of the things I was taught was that myself today in the work that I do, the things that I experience, the feelings that I have, the relationships that I try to establish, the healing that I'm doing, is all because of those 7 generations that have come before me. The trauma they've experienced, the healing that they've done, the work to build community, the social movements they've experienced, the pain, the heartache. The work that I do today is because of that. Whether it's good work, whether it's bad work, whether it's harm that I'm experiencing, it's all because of that. And everything I do today, I'm supposed to remember that it's going to impact the 7 generations to come. And so if one thing I do today can change the future, make it a little less heavy and a little more brighter for those 7 generations that are yet to come, then I'm doing what I need to do. If one conversation changes someone's perspective or supports someone's understanding, then I've done what I had to do. And if I've caused harm, then I hope that in the next generation, or even in my own generation, that I can repair that harm so that other generations don't have to experience it. And so the 7 generations principle, and even the understanding of Bidaben, is about recognizing that everything we do today takes into consideration the next 7 generations to come. Every decision we make, every thing we do, every conversation we have, we think those next generations that are yet to come. So that maybe those great grandchildren won't be scared to talk about who they are, won't have to hide who they are, won't have to try to figure out what a wampum belt is, what a treaty is, what residential schools are. That those are conversations we're having, but not in terms of pain, but in terms of healing. And that's what these concepts are. They're about how do we work together? How do we move forward together? How do we understand the past impacting the present and moving us forward? Because when we talk about Vidaba and when we talk about relationships, it talk about the concept of Minabid Maswan, or the good life. And when we talk about the good life, it's about how do we ourselves work in our own balance. And so in this picture, we have an image that has many circles, but also different understandings. And in the center, you have the self. And so that's me. We'll use myself as an example. And so myself, I'm at the very center. And one of the things I need to do to live the good life is to live in balance, not just with myself, not just with my own physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, but also I need to live in balance with my family, with the community, with the nation as a whole, with all my relationships. Minabid Maswan and living the good life is about understanding that change happens based, whether they're good or bad, based on our experiences and based on how well we try to keep ourselves in balance. I know that when I'm physically not feeling well, it's going to translate to my mental health. That I know that when my mental health isn't doing well, it's really going to start hitting my emotions. And when my emotions are feeling bad, it's going to impact my spirit. And that the moment I start taking care of one of those, the others start to do a little better too. And so if we're going to look to the mountain, as Gregory Cajete talks about it, it's about thinking of those future generations. It's about thinking of everything that I do for myself is impacting my family. It impacts my community. It impacts the land. Because if I'm having a hard day and I'm angry and I'm going around being angry and, you know, giving people, what is it, bitchy resting face, other people are going to be like, oh, she's angry, she's mad. Now that's impacting them. Once it starts impacting them, they're going to start being upset and feeling the impact and taking it on other people. That might mean maybe someone's then, I myself am not feeling well. I've been upset or been sharp or angry with someone, and they feel that energy and they decide, you know, I'm gonna go and drive home after a really crappy day talking to Lorena or hearing Lorena speak and she was really angry or whatever, and now I'm gonna have to drive home and I'm feeling upset, and now maybe I have road rage and maybe I start taking that out on other people in the road. Maybe whatever happens ends up in a car crash and someone else gets harmed, right? But not just that, but maybe then I used to smoke cigarettes all the time, right? And when I was stressed, I'd smoke cigarettes all the time. I was a very bad, constant smoker. And then I flick my cigarettes, right? I'm stressed. Now me flicking my cigarettes constantly is harming the land without properly disposing them and harming it and taking care of that in another way. So when we're not taking care of ourselves spiritually, physically, mentally, and emotionally, we can harm not just other people in their spirit and their emotions, but we can also harm the land. And so when we talk about this understanding of Bin Mazan to live the good life, it's understanding that when we don't take care of ourselves, it can have more impact, not just ourselves, but on those around us and the spaces around us. And the spaces that may no longer feel safe for people to go to. One of the things, and an amazing speaker, I love her, her name is Leanne Simpson. She shares, and this comes from her book, Dancing on the Turtle's Back. She says, our relationships extend out from the mother and child through our families, our clans, and our community. They also extend to the land and how we interact with the natural world. And so when we're talking about our relationships, when we're talking about our communities, how we're feeling, when we're talking about all these things, it's understanding that our relationships don't just touch the human world, that they touch the spiritual world, they touch the natural world, they touch the land. And to recognize that. So when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about sustainable development, and how do we see it from an Indigenous view or Indigenous lens, it's about understanding relationships and that key component to that work. So I have a larger question for the entire, I can open it up to the larger group. I'll put it in the chat. How does, and I'm going to change the question a bit, I'll put it in the chat still, but how do your, whether it's a project venture you're working on, whether it's school work, school projects that you're working on, whether it's work that you're doing, professional work, how might you consider future generations and relationships that will be impacted by that work? I know it's a very loaded question, but I'm just wondering if anyone have thoughts of maybe how, you know, the work that you do considers those future generations, or how do relationships reflect those future generations in the work that you're doing? And I'll let it sit for a minute or so, so it can stew. Rachel, and then Adele.
Good afternoon, everybody. I work with victims of crime and specifically in human trafficking. One of my areas is our missing Indigenous women and children. So for me, in particular, overall into the entire session as well, I can bring in hopes. I'm actually working with the Department of Justice for a trauma toolkit with Saskatchewan, the province of, but hopefully bringing the traumas and the pain to the table, going through, I understand as a new individual, as still learning, I'm learning and I understand so far that really, if you're not balanced with yourself completely, everything around you is disrupted. And when things are disrupted, the chances of recovery and healing and finding good solutions on, and this is on many different types of levels also, is very difficult to achieve. And when we address our issues, even if they're at home, even in our personal private relationships, maybe it's a family member or even a boyfriend, anyone that's involved in a situation where someone's spirit is brought down, whether it be a negative comment or mistreated, it takes everybody involved in it to recover and heal from it in order for things to properly move on. So I'm hoping with the trauma toolkit that I'm building, to help develop ways for everyone, not just women and children, but for everyone to find that balance and find those relationships and have them understand positive outlets and to take away the trauma is to talk about it and make things better and give people the tools that they need to have access to those and to help me figure out how they feel and kind of coming back and really trying to revive some of the lost traditions as well too. We're seeing a lot with the westernization, and we're seeing some of the youth change to try to live more of the civilian life rather than the native life. And then there's a lot of questions, a lot of communities, like the Jewish communities, they do that too. They kind of test the waters. I believe the Amish community also does the same thing too. They're given a little bit of time away from, and sometimes people run when they're scared. So if we can give hope and we can give people opportunities and ways to learn and to keep themselves balanced, that hopefully may not be worldwide, but even within one's own community or within their own home can find some peace and continue to fulfill their purpose, because we all are here for a purpose and a reason. And like that, each individual cob on the corn, even if we don't have a relationship with somebody in our community, we still need them somehow. I may not know my electrician, but I do know that he lives in my community and works. And so he helps me do my life and be able to do my part for our community. And I think that hopefully bringing those elements in will hopefully create a better world and progression and sustainability. And again,
Rachel.
I'm new to this and I might be completely off and wrong, and I appreciate and love any feedback and any opinion, and I agree, and it's more than okay for no one to agree with me.
Which, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing. And the work that you're doing with human trafficking is such important work. And so like what you're sharing around relationships and, you know, understanding those impacts and traumas is so key. So thank you for sharing and even doing that work, because it is important work within communities. Adele, I see your hands up as well.
Yes, hi. Thank you for allowing us to have this space to have this conversation. I appreciate it. I'm actually the founder of a, it's going to hopefully be a nonprofit soon. We have applied, but it's the 7th Generation Educational Alliance. And we are working on Indigenous and Native American curriculum to implement in K through 12 and university for college credit, and bridging that program together to not only give Native and Indigenous children a path towards the university and higher education, but also just giving back to the community. I'm actually a teacher. I run the special education department at a community school, and we have an ag arts program that we, from round to table kind of stuff that we do with the kids with chickens, and we have all these kinds of things where we also go out into the community for May Day and go to all the neighbors' houses around our community and give them May Day flowers. And we're just trying to really build that sense of, it's not just about you. It's not just about you in this space and time. It's about us in all spaces and all time. And they overlap and they overlay and they come back around. And just realizing that we are a drop in the river, but the river keeps going. So we have to make sure that our flow is one with it. So that's one of the things that we're working on. We're trying to implement, and just getting Indigenous studies out there, period. We did secure some funding to make, we have 4 workshops coming up that are going to be doing the dance, drums, and medicinal teaching and herbs. And so they'll get a certificate after that. It's for high school students to get a certificate with worth college credit, transfer to wherever they want to go, but hopefully also to get them hooked on learning more about their own story, because we all are connected. Like, I am not myself personally treated to any tribe. I'm what they would call a white girl, in all honesty, but my goal in life is to learn more and grow more and collaborate and be a part of something bigger than myself. And it's been such a long history of abuse and neglect that my personal background is in neuropsychology and trauma-informed teaching. So we're trying to heal that trauma, that generational trauma as well. So thank you guys for allowing this space, and I appreciate it. I've learned so much today. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele. Thank you for sharing. And Rachel, I see your hands back up.
Yes, I love to connect with you, Adele, after this is over. I am also, there's a lot to what my business does. I'm actually building with the Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's Office a couple different programs, which will, like, legal document preparations, which will help with name changes that I know are difficult up within the communities, lots of different things like that. But I am offering education and training for sustainable skills, and some of the skill sets that would be able to help each community also remain self-sustainable. So there's lots of also wonderful good things coming, and I also provide remote support groups, and the curriculums, like legal document preparations. There's administration. There's actually 9 fields I'm teaching them. There's taxes. My business also offers financial education, which can be transferred. So I provide work up to a year. So there's a big federal plan that's unrolling here this coming fall, at the end of October, the first 2 weeks of November. I would love to invite you guys to come and take a visit and see what wonderful things are coming. But a lot of great things are going to be happening. So I hope everyone is feeling really good, because I want everyone to be, and I want to make the community last. And I'm not Native American, traditionally speaking, but my roots are Native American. My mom looks like Pocahontas. I'm looking forward to being able to get back to the community and to make sure that we can sustain. And if I can teach training, even like mental health training, and they're certified and they can take their degrees and their certifications accredited. They can take them anywhere they want after they have a good year working with my company. They get taught, they get a checking account. I have a couple banks underneath my belt to provide for people with no credit, no social securities. I mean, there's felonies and all kinds of good things, giving people the opportunity to grow. But if we use these tools together, as an American, I never graduated high school knowing how to balance a checkbook. It took me until I was in my early 20s. They didn't teach me how to make my money work for me or make my resources or my skill set work for me. Kind of broadened the system of just, you're bred in just to be a worker and not a human. And we are all a human. And I think that's what good thing people are missing. And I'm excited to bring lots of beautiful skills that can be brought back to each's reservation and communities and bring back the individuality that we all deserve.
Thank you, and miigwech Rachel for sharing. I think one of the most important things is, you talked about education, and so did you as well, Adele. And I think one of the best gifts we have in the world is education. And my actual master's work was looking at how, education is more than just a diploma or a certificate. At my education and my master's work was about community-based knowledge as learning. And so it's about going to community and saying, is this what's important to you? And how can we best support you in getting what you need and what you want? And how do we help you? And part of that, and once we have education, we get knowledge, we have that responsibility then to ensure that the action that happens is based on, community priorities and really working together to support those future generations. And so it's really where we build that knowledge, is through community, through relationships. So the last thing I just want to touch on, there's one video I do want to share. It's the Winona Duke video. It's about 16 minutes, and I think I'll just end it on that because she's just like mic drop. She's amazing. If you ever have a chance to listen to her speak or watch any of her YouTube videos, please do. So I'm gonna share that, and I'm hoping the sound will be loud enough for everyone. Let's see.
Ani nindoe maganaduk, ngagoi kitamagas, bine seque to go makwa and dodam, go babani cog, ish kaniganing and nunjaba, miigwech. Greeting you in Ojibwe, as you probably gathered, a language from this Omaha king here. And I'm thanking you very much for the honor of being here. I'm telling you, I'm from White Earth up north, my reservation. I'm calling you my relatives. I wanted to start like that because I thought about what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, which is that food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. And indeed, that is how we consider food. Food has a culture, it has history, it has stories, it has relationships that tie us to our food. Food is more than something you just buy at the store, something that just doesn't have a stamp on it. In our community, we are told a long time ago by our prophets. Our Anishinaabe people lived on the eastern seaboard. And we're related to those people out there, the Wampanoags and others. And we were instructed by our prophets that we should follow a shell which appeared in the sky. And in following that shell, we would arrive at the place where the food grows upon the water. And that food that grows upon the water is monoman, or wild rice. So we were instructed by the Creator to move here. Omaha came to this place. And our wild rice, our monoman, is our most sacred food. It is a food that is first food given to a child when they can eat solid. It is last food before you pass into the spirit world. As for all our feasts and all our ceremonies, it is very important to us. And we, as you know, we fought hard and long to keep our rice and to keep it good. This is a picture of Nokomis and Nana Buju. That's our spirit beings from who we descend, making wild rice. And this is my community today. Do pretty much the same thing as we did for 1,000 years. We got an aluminum canoe now instead of a birch bark. Hard to get trees that size these days. But we still rice. And then the month that is called Menominake Gizis, Wild Rice Making Moon, August into September, you'll see our people go out on the lakes. And we feel a great joy when we go out there with our 2 sticks in a canoe, go out there and harvest the rice. Sometimes it's tall or short or fat or skinny or looks like a bottle brush or looks all punked out. It's diverse. And that's how we can keep it, because when a wind comes through, it blows off some of the rice, doesn't blow off other rice. There's great diversity, in that. We still parch it the same way over a fire. You can dance on your rice and your new moccasins and do pretty much the same thing for all these years. And that defines us as Anishinaabe people. Our story of our relationship to food is similar to the relationship that other people have to their foods. This is Jerry Kononui on the big island of Hawaii. And this is kalo, or taro. There's about 80 varieties of taro that exist in Hawaii. And they refer to it as part of their cosmogenealogy. I never heard that word until I was over there. And what they said is that in their original stories, in their original beings, the sky and the stars had a child. And the first child born was a son named Kalo. And he is born stillborn. And they buried that child. And then the mother cried, and when she cried, from that child and from the ground emerged Kalo, or taro. As the elder stillborn, the younger child that was born was Kane, or the Hawaiian. And so they consider that the taro is their elder brother. And so it is not surprising that they, like the Ojibwe people, as you may know, we fought the genetic engineering of our wild rice, also the patenting of our wild rice. It will not surprise you that the Native Hawaiians also fought against the genetic engineering of their cosmogenealogy, of their older relative, and fought the patenting. I like to call this picture, white men can't dance. Well, it has to do, these people are doing it's like a haka. They're summoning their ancestors in their dance to come forward and to help them to face off with the enemy, in this case, genetic engineering, and the University of Hawaii. And they're facing a bunch of white guys in suits at the University of Hawaii, are probably a little concerned with the arrival of the Hawaiians here. And in this case, the Hawaiians defeated them, both on the patenting issue. The patents were torn up at this meeting on the food itself. And they also, in Hawaii, they have a ban on the big island of Hawaii on the genetic engineering of taro. One of the first and only places in the country that such a ban has been maintained. But our peoples are very concerned about our relatives, our responsibility to keep them. There's a similar story that is told with the Maori people of Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. I'm not sure what was new about it, but anyway. So they have this potato there called peru, which has the highest level of Andean genetics of any potato in the Pacific. Andean meaning that it is from South America. And thousands of years ago, seafaring Maoris went to South America and brought this potato back before any petroleum or Captain Cook or anybody. And they had this potato, and they grow this potato. And so as you can imagine, when the universities in New Zealand wanted to genetically engineer these potatoes, they again were faced with the Maoris, who said, we don't think that's a good idea. We don't want you to do that, and we're going to oppose you. And they won. There are no genetically engineered potatoes there. And in that, they reestablished a relationship with the Aymara people from Peru area, who thanked them for protecting their sacred food as well. So these stories are worldwide issues on the challenges that our relatives face whether it is genetic engineering or whether it is patenting. But perhaps the more prominent issue that we are facing is in fact the extinction of species of foods in themselves. Over the past 100 years, you've seen a 75% decline in agrobiodiversity. That is to say, the species of seeds, vegetables, common things that existed 100 years ago do not exist today. Many of them extinct, whether in Canada or in the United States or on a worldwide scale. And increasingly, you're seeing that today, for instance, the vast majority of corn that is grown here in this country has one genetic ancestor. This is something that is a little bit frightening. In addition to that, we are seeing that there is a more concentration of the ownership of these seeds themselves by fewer and fewer. This has big implications for our peoples. My community, the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, on our reservation, 1/3 of the population served by Indian Health Service has diabetes. Diabetes is caused by the rapid transition from a traditional food to industrialized foods. And increasingly that is occurring across this country where dietary-related illnesses are becoming dominant sources of ill health in this country in themselves. It has a huge health impact, this loss of access to our traditional foods. Because today they're saying that we get the vast majority of our calories from less than 30 varieties of foods, concentration in fewer and fewer, and a lot of them, of course, kind of greasy in themselves. Then there is an economic issue. You could look at it a couple ways. One, concentration of ownership of seeds in a few corporations. Increasingly, farmers who held these seeds and had the cultural patrimony, rights, relationship, and the wealth in themselves are being deprived of that by patenting laws and increasing ownership. About 7 corporations control almost all the seeds that are commercially available in the world. Yeah? In our own communities, though, this is a problem in itself. My reservation, you know, our Ojibwe people, totally self-sufficient until pretty recently on food. That is to say, before 100 years ago, we were the northernmost corn producers in the world. We push corn 100 miles north of Winnipeg. Many varieties, a multitude of sources. Maple syrup, that was us way before Aunt Jemima, you know. All those foods we had in our community, yeah? But today we don't produce most of those foods. So my reservation, which is stricken with a good deal of poverty, you know, as many other Indian reservations, we find that we spend about $8 million a year on food, and of that we spend $7 million like that, off reservation, purchased Walmart, Food Service of America, Cisco, etc. If you look at it, it's almost, and what you buy on the reservation, you end up buying just a little bit that is in the food stores there, and what the vast majority of the food stores there sell is junk food. You know, good food not accessible. In that food economy represents about 1/4 of our tribal economy, which is lost down the drain through different sources, something which could be a source of wealth for us in our community. I don't know how to quantify the cultural grief associated with loss of your most ancient varieties. I don't know what that price tag is, but I know that it is significant, you know, what is happening to our peoples. But it is not just what is happening to our community, it's what the future is going to look like for all of us. Because we're sitting in Minneapolis today and it's 100 degrees out. That is climate change, is what is going on here. You've got floods in parts of the country. You got a good portion of the country is on fire right now, right? You got tornadoes coming down. They are saying that over the next 20 years, we're going to spend 20% of world GDP on climate change-related disasters. And amidst that, we have a food system that is increasingly concentrated in both its monoculture and its ownership. They're projecting a 34% loss in corn crop in North Dakota. And what I am concerned about is the fact that we don't have all the seeds we could have at the table. What we have is a concentration and a rising sense of food insecurity. So we have some ideas on this. This is my community. We have this corn restoration project. This Bear Island flint corn we've been working on for a long time. It's good corn, and in that corn in itself, it came from Bear Island in the middle of Leech Lake. I got about this much from a seed grower. He gave it to me, and now we have fields of it. It grows about this tall, has big ears, doesn't require irrigation, frost resistant, and when a sear wind comes through, Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn tips over, but our corn is still standing. That is the corn we are looking at. The one in the middle, beautiful, pink lady corn, kind of a magenta colored corn. I just like how it looks. Tastes good too. And this other one, Pawnee Eagle corn. They say that the Pawnees were given corn from the corn mother, had this corn for all their time. And when they lived in Nebraska, they did good with their corn, and their other people came, the settlers came to see them. And when the settlers came, they got on good with the Pawnees. They traded horses and had them fix their wagon wheels and various things. But the government forced the Pawnees to leave and go to Oklahoma. And when they went, they took their corn with them, but it did not grow. It did not grow. And so for many years, they grieved the loss of their corn, got less and less, till they just had like 25 different seeds. And then one day, the descendants of the settlers in Kearney, Nebraska, asked if they could help grow those corn varieties again. And they petitioned the Pawnees. Deb Echohawk, the Pawnee seed keeper, talked to the elders, and they said, we'll let them try, because we can't grow our corn. They sent that corn back to Nebraska, and that corn flourished, and their varieties flourished. And so the descendants of the settlers today grow the corn for the Pawnees. And what Deb told me was that the corn remembered the land it came from. It is a story. Corn has a history, it has a story, and in this case, it is a form of redemption. That is the work we are doing in our community. We're working to bring back our sugar bush. That's the first harvest of the season. That's my youngest son sucking the sap out of the tree, eating my profits. We like this though. We feel good when we are in the sugar bush. And we are trying to grow back all our old varieties. This young man, that's a Lakota squash. And that squash in itself was given to me in October, and I ate it in May. Why am I telling you that? Because it's a perfect carbon-reduced food. It didn't require refrigeration, freezing, or canning. It just hung out, was a squash, delicious that much later. Yeah? And so it's not just it's not just that you grow local food, it's also what you grow. Because it turns out a lot of these old varieties are higher in amino acids, antioxidants, protein, trace minerals than anything you can buy at the store. Now, I don't know why that is. What I figure is that in creating industrialized foods that they could move 1,500 miles from farmer to table, they created foods that would respond well to pesticides, were uniform, could be picked well with whatever equipment they were using, and would transport well. And somehow in that, I think that they lost some nutritional value, And so these seeds are the endangered ones, but these are the ones that in our theory are the seeds not just for now, but are the seeds and the hopes for the future. Now, as I reflected what to talk to you about here tonight, I remembered that my father, he passed away about 15 years ago, but he used to tell me something which, you're all pretty smart people, you're probably like me. He said, Winona, you're a really smart young woman. He said, but I don't want to hear your philosophy if you can't grow corn. That's what he said. And there's something in that was right. We could be smart in our heads, but until we restore that relationship that we have with the foods that the Creator gave us, we're missing something, We need to buy these foods locally. We need to support this. That's how you address climate change in itself. Go organic and local. Sequester your carbon. But more than that, to me, it is also about how we reestablish this relationship with our ancestors and our relatives, the ones that have roots. Miigwech, thank you.
So one of the things I just wanted to end on, and I know it's getting close to 8:30, and we may have a few minutes for questions, but one of the things that I think is so important when we talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, when we're talking about sustainability and sustainable development, and you can even hear it in a lot of what Winona talks about, is you can't separate environmental justice from racial justice, from social justice, from climate change. They're all related. And if we try to separate them, we end up impacting the others. And so it's about recognizing the different relationships that are so integral to that work. It's about recognizing those histories from the past, how it's impacting us in the present, and how we can move forward in the future. Because it remembers the land. Our relationships remember the land. Our food remembers the land. The plants remember the land. Our histories remember the land. And so bringing it all back to land acknowledgements and how we started today, by land acknowledgements is just a start of how we can move towards sustainable development. But it's about rebuilding those relationships. And if you're doing a land acknowledgement, understanding your own relationship to the spaces and places and where you reside in the communities that are there. And so really understanding why the land is so important. Because if we survive and the land does not, we won't survive long. We cannot live without the land. But if we were to all disappear one day as humans, the land and animals and fish and waters and insects, they would thrive without us. And so it's important for us to remember our relationships to it, to remember our relationships, and to remember the land, because the land remembers as well. So that is my presentation. I'm going to say Miigwech, and if I don't know if there's any questions or anything, or if there's anything else I have to do, I'm going to leave that to the edge people.
Well, I was gonna say thank you so much, Lorena, and I'm actually gonna put a feedback form in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for today. Please fill out the feedback form to let us know how you thought about tonight's session. I mean, I think Lorena's amazing, so I would always give it 5 out of 5 for myself, but we always love honest feedback. So please make sure that you fill that out. But yes, thank you so much, Lorena, for sharing the knowledge and the perspectives.
Marcy. Hi, Marcy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lorena, and everyone who joined tonight. If we can ask the SIC folks to stay behind just for a couple of minutes. But for everyone else, thank you for joining. Like Erica mentioned at the very beginning, we will have more sessions that are open to the public that you're welcome to join. So those you can check out through our Eventbrite page. And we hope to see you in the future ones. Thank you all and have a good night.